should be lethal. Hello everyone, I'm back with another guide, and today it will be a guide on what I think is the best deck in Standard, but it's for sure not the easiest one. The deck was pretty much under the radar before Master Tour Silvermoon, but after me and Frozen and a bunch of other notable players had incredibly strong performances in that Master Tour with the deck, the deck has started to catch on and slowly but steadily becoming more and more popular among the top players. Over the span of 3 weeks, it has gone from an unusual pick to the most broad deck in the Grandmasters League. According to data sites, it's very clear that the deck is struggling though when you look at the lower rank brackets. And I think that a big reason for this is because it's probably one of the harder decks I think I've ever came across in Standard in terms of how important it is that you can pilot it somewhat decently. And that's why, as someone that has played the deck a lot, I decided to record this video to try and explain a bit more of how to pilot the deck. In this video, I will go over how the deck works. I will go over basic mulligans, some of the most popular matchups and how to play them, and then I will answer a few questions. But before we get into that, may I just ask you to hit the subscribe button. It would help me out a lot, and I'd really appreciate it, and you can stay notified for other guides and videos that I upload in the future. Thank you. And if you want to see me play this deck live, you can also follow me on either my Twitch, my Twitter, or join our Discord. I'll drop links in the description below. So first things first, how does the deck work? It can be a little bit confusing looking at the deck list because you don't really see a clear win condition. But basically, your primary win condition is through being an OTK deck. Your game plan is to draw through your entire deck, and as you get to the end of it, you play 2 Ethereal Log Merchants, you play 2 Garrotes that then deal 4 and shuffles bleeds. These bleeds that the Garrote shuffles in are affected by spell damage, so if you have +2 spell damage when you draw the bleeds, they're gonna deal 4. That way, through Garrote and spell damage, you deal upwards 30 plus damage through this combo, and I'll include a clip to show you what a combo turn looks like. As you can see here, I've already set up by stepping my field contact. I play contact Octobot, use Ethereal Log Merchant to reduce the remaining cards in my hand. And with only a few cards left, I am able to play enough battle cries that I get to the end of my deck. What you have to be careful of is that you count so that you have enough mana and can play all the necessary cards. You need to fit in the field contact, most of the time the Octobot, enough battle cries, and also playing the Garrotes. And as I'm getting close to the end of my deck, I play the last Battlecry card, play both Garrotes and got plenty of spell damage to deal more than 30 damage to my opponent. And you see that each bleed that is drawn from my deck is dealing 5 damage because I have 3 spell damage on board over the course of the turn. And that is how you execute the combo with this deck. But executing the combo is somewhat easy when you get the hang of it, but the hard part is, well, the whole point about drawing your entire deck. To do this, you are probably going to recognize both Field Contact and Octobot because they were really prevalent in last meta in what we call Baron's Rogue. But there are some big differences that it's important to point out between these two decks. The biggest difference is probably the utilization of Field Contact. With Baron's Rogue, you could play Field Contact to just draw a few cards, because eventually you draw into Jandis or Alexstrasza. That would take over the board, and you would win the game that way. In this deck, you are a lot less board focused, and you need to set up so that your Field Contact turns are on average a lot bigger. Luckily for us, we have some additional card draw spells now in Shadow Concealment and Swindle that helps us find our key cards that are in most games gonna be Field Contact and Efficient Octobot. So it's all pretty matchup dependent, but if I were to explain an average game, I'd say that usually you start the early game by trying to play card draw spells, as in Swindle and Shroud. As you get to a rather large hand size, you reduce your hand with Efficient Octobot and either Guardian Aug Merchant, Prize Plunderer, Brain Freeze, or Ethereal Aug Merchant. And either on the same turn or the turn after, you try and draw a bunch of cards with Field Contact, which gives you more card draw and secret passages and things that makes it pretty easy for you to, as efficient as possible, get through the rest of your deck. So basically, card draw, Octobot, Field Contact. The mid game of the deck, after you play out your first Field Contact turn, can be a little bit hard to explain because it's very much dependent on what pieces you draw and how to utilize those pieces. But you're trying to set up until your deck has about 10 or less cards, I'd say. And then you end the game through going for your second Field Contact and draw the remaining cards through Sheep Battle Cries and play the Garrotes and finish them in the same turn. Usually you don't need to be in fatigue and then pass over the turn, but you can kill your opponents when you have several cards left in your deck because you get through your deck as you progress with your Field Contact turn. This is about the easiest visual guide I could get you. Step 1 is reduce the cost of your hand with Efficient Octobot, either on the turn before or the turn where you're going off, depending on how much mana you have. Make sure to do this when you have like about 10 to 5 cards left in your deck. Step number 2 is play Field Contact, and then you draw through the rest of your deck on that turn with Battle Cries. As you get through your entire deck and reach fatigue, you play your 2 Garrotes that are hopefully quite cheap through Octobot reductions or through reducing them with preparation. And then with enough spell damage on board, you play a Battle Cry card and draw the remaining bleeds to kill your opponent. Alright. Before we get into mulligans and stuff, last thing, let's talk about combo breakpoints. So the damage you're dealing through playing Garrote with an empty deck and then drawing your bleeds is if you have 0 spell damage, well, that's pretty easy. Each Garrote is 8 damage, deal 16. Then for each additional point of spell damage, you deal 8 more. That means that if you have 1 Ethereal Aug Merchant active on board, you're going to deal 24. If you have 2, which is the point you're trying to get to most of the time, because most of the time your opponents aren't above 30, is 2 spell damage. And you don't necessarily need both Ethereal Aug Merchants, but for example, if you have, say, the Shadow Step, if your Aug Merchant plus Shadow Step just works just as well as double Aug Merchant. And then you can increase by going with free spell damage if you have double Aug Merchant plus Step. For up to 40 damage with 2 steps, you deal 48. You get the point. Remember, Garrotes with 2 spell damage is 32 damage, and then plus minus 8 for each additional point or each point that you're decreasing spell damage with. All right. Now when I covered what I hope is most of the basics of how the deck functions, let's talk about probably the most important step, which is the Mulligan. Luckily, the Mulligan, like as a base, is probably the simplest part of the deck. How I approach it is that I pretty much never mulligan Efficient Octobot or Field Contact. If you have multiples of them, you can probably throw one away, but I'm keeping the first Field Contact and the first Octobot in every matchup anytime. On top of that, and this is where it gets a little bit more arguable, I'm a big fan of keeping Shroud of Concealment and Swindle, because I think that the most important step for setting up is through getting your card draw early. So I like keeping these cards unless I am up against something super aggressive, like, say, Face Hunter or Shadow Priest. You're probably wondering, how about the cards like Price Plunder and Brain Freeze against aggressive decks? And I would recommend to, first and foremost, always look for Octobot and Field Contact. If you already have some number of these, then you can start keeping cards like Price Plunder, Shadow Step, maybe even with that, and Brain Freeze if you're up against aggressive decks. But if your hand is only Plunderers and Brain Freezes, but you have no Octobot and Field Contact, I like throwing those away. And on top of that, as a general rule of thumb, I think personally that preparation is a really fine keep if you already have Shroud of Concealment or Swindle. There's just not a lot of downside because you already have your card draw, so you're gonna make up for the card loss, and it just makes your early game run a lot smoother. Then there are some more niche applications, like, for example, you want to have Neophyte in your mulligan against, say, Druid, but these applications are very few, and in general, just mulligan incredibly aggressively for Field Contact, Octobot, and your card draw spells. And I should probably mention Kazakus, because I get that the most popular list of the deck runs this card. How I approach Kazakus in the mulligan, which I played a lot, is that Kazakus is incredibly good versus aggressive decks, and you want to keep it in those because the 5-mana Golem is pretty good at taking over the game. It's less good on coin, but as a rule of thumb, I would probably usually keep Kazakus. But start considering if it's worth keeping in the mulligan on coin a lot of the time. Also, on that note, more often than not, you're going for 1-mana Golem, and you shouldn't just pick 5-mana Golems as you used to do in the Barons meta. But a cheap Battlecry for Field Contact through Kazakus can be very good a lot of the time. All right, so we covered how the deck works and how to mulligan. So what about the deck's matchups? Here's the sample that I got after about almost 200 games with the deck. This is the games I've played on stream, so and playing this deck while also talking to chat and doing a million other things is quite difficult. But to go over them, I think that Demon Hunter is a fairly good matchup. It's a close one, depending a little bit if they're playing the Brute version or the OTK version. I think that the Brute version is slightly easier to win against, because you can utilize that they don't play any removal spells. You can just tempo most of your cards and win that way. Druid is a mix of Celestial Druid and Aggro Druid. I think both of them are good matchups. Hunter, and I guess I'll go over Shadow Priest in the same section. I'd say they're favored, but they're pretty close, as you can see through the stats. It's pretty dependent on you finding Octobot in the early game, and then taking over the board through sheer tempo. I'll go into how to play this matchup a little bit later, but usually those matchups are not as combo focused, and while you are primarily a combo deck, you also can play for the board in more aggressive matchups. Well, Mage is... I apparently don't have huge sample size, but I think it's better than... Well, the super small sample size I got would imply. Basically, you're a faster combo deck than them. Your deck usually ends games on 7 and 8 if you go undisrupted, as you do most of the time against Mage. You also have Neophytes to disrupt their game plan. Paladin, great matchup. You fight for board better than they do, and they can usually don't kill you before you combo them. Shaman, I think, is slightly better than my stats would imply. I think that Quest Shaman is a really good matchup. Very much the same thing as against Paladin. They aren't super explosive, and you can deal with your boards fairly well, and you can kill them pretty quick through since their deck has very little disruption. Then Warlock and then Handlock is what I've been playing against on ladder most. I think it's a close matchup. People have split opinions on this one, but I think that this is one of the closer matchups where I think that most of the other matchups are quite favored if you're piloting the deck at a high level. But I'll go into more matchup details later, but the matchup is fairly close, but there's also a lot of play from both ends that can affect the outcome of the game. Warrior, haven't played against it much. I can't really speak of how good / bad the matchup is, but Warrior isn't exactly that prevalent in the meta. Also worth noting, these games are pretty much all at high legend, played within top 100 legend. Okay, so I'll go over a few of the more popular matchups on ladder, and let's start with Warlock. In the Warlock matchup, I'd like to keep cards like Shadow Concealment and Swindle. I think the matchup usually goes in a way that they are spending most of their early game using their life tap to set up their hand, while you set up your field contact turn with Shadow Concealment, Swindle's Octobot. And then it's all about how you pilot the mid game. It might seem on their end like not too much is happening because they're not playing cards, but how most Warlock builds are working now these days is that very little happens, and then before you know it, they are playing a bunch of Flesh Giants and Neophytes on the same turn, and they follow it up with the Battleground Battlemaster and they kill you. The main card to keep in mind when you play against Warlock is the effectiveness of a Cult Neophyte versus your hand, and they can usually play multiples of them through Raise Dead, which can be very hard to combo through. And since they're tapping so much, most of the time they will have access to it in the mid game, so plan accordingly. And with planning accordingly, some of the stuff you should keep in mind when you play this matchup is that if what you're fearing is that they play Neophyte and Flesh Giant in the same turn and they kill you through that, a resource that might be worth saving is Brain Freeze. So you can just freeze their Flesh Giant and have another turn, and then combo off on a turn where they hopefully don't have Cult Neophyte. On top of that, Prize Plunderer can be really good in the mid game to elevate some pressure that they're putting on you. And if you run Kazakus, for example, the Freezing Golem, the one that freezes a minion, is similarly good, especially if you combine it with Shadow Step. All of these to buy time until you are not under the Cult Neophyte effect. Because trying to combo off through Cult Neophyte, while it's possible, it is incredibly complicated, and most of the time you can't, but need to wait another turn to do so. Next up, we have Priest and the Aggro decks. Against aggro, I generally tend to throw away things like Shroud and Swindle, unless I already have preparation, whereas I think they're still good keeps. But the most important card against aggro is Efficient Octobot, and you generally want to play for tempo. I still keep Field Contact, even if I don't have Octobot, but other than that card, I'm pretty much throwing everything away in search for Octobot. If you already have Octo, you can start keeping things like Price Plunderer and Brain Freeze. But the game plan differs a little bit against aggro than it does against, say, Warlock or other slower decks, because you don't have to rely on your combo to win the game. These matches play out more like the old Baron's Miracle Rogue if you have experience with it, in terms of that you can just win the game through board. You are drawing more cards than them and just like take over the game in sheer card advantage, and can usually get there through sticking a board that deals consistent damage to kill them. So playing your Garrotes in the early or mid game just to activate, say, like a Brain Freeze or a Wand Thief, things of that nature, it is completely valid, and you don't need to save a lot of resources to combo. The most problematic card, as we have learned at this point, is always gonna be Mindrender Illusion. Mindrender Illusion is incredibly effective against you because if you try to set up the sort of Field Contact turn through reducing your hand with Octobot the turn before, they can very often play Mindrender Illusion and sabotage your entire hand to the point of no return. So luckily there are a few ways to play around Mindrender, but depending on how much pressure you are under, you can't do this all the time. So it's important that you keep track to be like, oh, can I afford to play around Mindrender, or do I just have to hope that they don't have it? But as a ways to play around Mindrender, it includes basically to activate your Octobot on the same turn as you play the rest of your hand. So say that you're on 5 mana, you play an Octobot, you play an Og Merchant, and then you also have Field Contact plus whatever one-cost cards that are reduced to 0, or maybe like a Neophyte reduced to 1. And if you play all of those cards in the same turn, then you replace your hand with one that costs actual mana, and Mindrender isn't as effective against you, and you also won the board. But sometimes you just have to run out your Octobot, and then if they can attack into it and play Mindrender, they destroy your hand. But general rule of thumb, to play around Mindrender, you reduce your hand and play your cards in the same turn, which is, if you keep that in mind as you play, it's easier. It's easier than you think to do this, even though it sounds like a lot. And on the topic of aggro, and something that I haven't really touched on, is that against pretty much any other sort of deck, you don't want to tempo your Octobot most of the time, because it's incredibly backbreaking if your Octobot gets killed without reducing something, and you have so many ways of activating your Octobot that most of the time you can save it until you have a safe activation. But against aggro decks, Hunter and Priest, just like in the old Baron's Rogue, a lot of the time it can be correct to play turn 1 or turn 2 efficient Octobot just to get that sort of tempo advantage. Something I don't recommend doing in other matchups, but against aggro, this is a good play. Last matchup I'll touch on is the Rogue Mirror, and you can apply these to most combo matchups. Not a lot to say. You're both kind of just trying to do your own thing. So, well, congrats to those that want to complain about solitaire meta. But yeah, basically, you are just trying to do your thing as efficient as possible, while hoping that your opponent can do it less efficient than you. I mean, it's not... I make this sound less complicated than it is, because it's a lot of being efficient execution. but there's not like a whole lot of interaction. You're looking for card draw, you're looking for field contact, you're looking for Octobot. The big card to keep in mind that does interact with your opponent in a very favorable way is called Neophyte. Just as in the Warlock matchup, that it's incredibly hard to combo through a Cold Neophyte. So if you're behind, if you can play Neophytes and step Neophyte, or do similar things, that's a way to buy time to get yourself ahead. Also, keep in mind that your opponent can Neophyte you, and try to keep that in mind. But basically, you're just trying to execute your own thing as efficient as possible. There can be a bit of a board battle in the mirror. So when someone goes off with the field contact, they usually build a rather large board at the same time. So, I mean, it's definitely not where your priorities lie, but just keep in mind that your opponent can build a board, and it would be nice for if you could remove it, because if you don't keep it in mind, then they can run away and just play the tempo Garrote game, and you lose to that every now and then. But most of the time, I'd say that it's about some volume of combo, and usually isn't decided too much by tempo. But look for windows where you can get ahead on tempo, and make sure to close windows where your opponent is trying to do so. Last thing I'm gonna do is to get into viewers' questions, but before that, I think that Secret Passage is a card that I barely talked about, and that is probably the card I received the most questions of, how to use it. And also, when I've been watching other top players play this, I think Secret Passage is the card that I see being misused a lot of the time. So what you're noticing when I talk through the deck and how it works is that the Secret Passage is never mentioned. I'm not mentioning it in the early game, mid game, or late game. So when is it good? That's pretty much a nice thing about the card, that it's never essential for anything your deck is doing, but rather on turns where you might not have a strong power play, Secret Passage makes sure to always fill in the gaps. That means that if you have a perfect draw, then maybe you won't even need to play a single Secret Passage throughout the game, but it salvages a lot of draws where you're missing a piece of some sort. So say, for example, if your hand is field contact, shrouds, and all of these clunky cards, you can play Secret Passage in the early game to try and find either maybe an Octobot and a step to build up your hand so that it becomes less clunky. If you have all the sheep battle cries but no field contact, you can, and this is probably the way I use Secret Passage most, is that you play it with on 4 mana to try and find Shroud or Swindle. One of the uses I see people not use Passage for enough is that while Passage isn't great on finding field contact, because you have to play field contact, you usually don't have a lot of mana to spend on it, it's still useful for this purpose, because you can hit stuff like field contact and shadow step in combination to get field contact back in your hand. And that is pretty useful. Or you can hit the card draw that in turn draws you field contact, so it stays in your hand post passage. So keep that in mind. You also use it quite often, with like even as your last mana on field contact turns, to say try and find a clutch shadow step for say Price Plunderer or something similar. But most of the time, how I try and use this card is that I passage and look for card draw, Wand Thief, and just make it so I use it before I use my first efficient Octobot to build up a bigger hand, and that makes the turn where I go off even more explosive. But I can talk as much as possible about Secret Passage, but the card requires you to have a pretty good feel of the deck. So just practice on how to use Passage, see what spots it works out in and whatnot. Just learn by trial and error. last thing I want to go over is I asked my followers on Twitter whatever Garrote Rogue questions they had. And here I picked up some of the best questions that I don't think I covered really enough through the guide so far. The most common question I got, and that comes from a fellow content creator, Clark Hellscream, that I think put it really well, is that Shadow Step is a card that is incredibly volatile in how you use it. So basically what it comes down to with Shadow Step is that at the end of the game, if you are required to deal 30 damage that you want to have either 2 Ethereal Augmentations, or if you use 1 Ethereal Augmentation early on, which you can, then you need to say 1 step for it. This is only in games where you need to deal 30. There are some decks like Aggro decks which don't play healing, so maybe you can ship them down to 24, and then you could just finish the game with 1 Augmentation. That works. In those cases, you can use both Shadow Steps before the end of the game. So it all comes down to planning ahead. The use I often use Shadow Step for is that I Shadow Step my field contact a lot in the early game. I can get my card draw chain going through playing like a field contact, like the old school Baron's Miracle Rogue, just drawing like 2-3 cards with field contact. Then stepping it at the end of that turn not only makes it so I still have 1 more contact turn to go off on, it also makes the contact cheap and probably makes my second contact a lot cheaper. A play that comes up that I don't do too often, but like just to prove the point, is that you can just play field contact on 3 and step it just to have a 1 mana contact in your hand. In combo matchups, using 1 or both of your steps, depending on if you use an Augmentation or not, on Neophyte can be incredibly useful. And in combo matchups, especially combo matchups that also play Neophytes or against Handlock, if you already have a high volume of cards, so that you don't necessarily need to draw extra cards from your contact or the rest of your cards, stepping Octobot can be useful. I find this particularly relevant in the Handlock matchup that is quite a lot of arrays and being able to beat Colt Neophyte. Against aggro decks, that's probably where it's the easiest to use Shadow Step, because in those matchups you really don't rely on your combo. So in these matchups, just use Shadow Step for max tempo possible. If you pair it together with Prize Plunderer to kill off their board, that's great. And you can even use it on stuff like SI Skulker together with Field Contact to get extra cheap cards. You can use it on Guardian Augmentation to protect more minions. Just go as heavy on tempo as you possibly can. So, okay, to summarize, the rule of thumb for Shadow Step is that as long as you keep track that you have 2 Augmentations in the relevant matchups by the end of the game, then you can use your Shadow Step effectively. If you use 1 Augmentation for tempo, then you generally need to say 1 Shadow Step for the endgame combo. But if you still have both Augmentations chilling at the bottom of the deck, then use Shadow Step as effectively as you can for other purposes. Next question comes from Spooky, which is asking, should you use Octo to push tempo swings, or wait to discount a lot of Battlecry cards and just hold them until you draw contact? What is the sweet spot? What strategy should you go in the games you don't draw contact? I'll start with the first question. Generally, I think that compared to old Baron's Rogue, you tempo Octobot a lot less. Again, specifically Priest and Hunter, the tempo Octobot can be incredibly useful, but in matchups like the Mirror or against the Warlock and similarly, I really try to save my Octobot until I can save up a lot of Battlecry cards. On the same token, just as they're saying, if you reduce stuff like Wand Thief to 0 mana, it's generally correct to hold them until you find your field contact and can get additional value out of them instead of just playing them immediately at the first possible spot. Second question, what strategy should you go in the games where you don't draw contact, well, you pretty much have to draw contact in most games. The good thing here is that your deck is very good at doing so. You can maximize the odds of drawing contact by not mulliganing Shroud of Concealment or Swindle or similar cards. If you have a secret passage but you don't have a field contact yet, maybe save the passage until you have more mana so that you can hit card draw or just the contact step immediately from the passage, and basically plan around the hand you got. But sooner or later, you pretty much have to draw field contact, which means that you aren't mulliganing the card, and you try to maximize the odds of finding it through your other cards. Even without contact, the deck cycles remarkably quickly. So I can't really count many games where I don't find a contact in time. But if you pilot correctly, those games are very few and far between. Third question is from Grandmaster themselves, Luna. They ask, when you have Octobot, Aug Merchant, and Field Contact, do you like one extra mana of contact or one extra draw? Basically, what Luna means with this is that in spots where you're going to find yourself in, where you're going to play Field Contact, Octobot, and Aug Merchant in the same turn, if you go for it in the order of Contact, Octobot, Aug Merchant, that's going to cost you 5 mana, but you're going to draw 1 card from the Contact. But if you go about it in the order of Octobot, Aug Merchant, Field Contact, that's going to cost you 4 mana, so you save 1 mana, but you won't draw a card from the Aug Merchant because you played the Field Contact afterwards. Out of these options, generally, it's context dependent, but in rule of thumb would be to save the mana, because the deck is so good at drawing that if you have a high amount of cards, then drawing 1 extra card from Battlecry is going to be less worth than saving a mana. But in spots where you might be low on cards, or you just have like 1 more Battlecry or something to go together with the Field Contact, then it might be useful to go for the first option. But as a rule of thumb, your hand size is going to be pretty big, and in those spots I would go for Octobot, Aug Merchant, Field Contact almost every time. If you are executing your combo early in the game, like say round 7-8, I found it generally to be incredibly crucial that you save the mana and go for it in the order shown on screen, because you very often end up being tight on mana, but usually have excess battle cries to execute the combo. But it's also one of these things where you learn as you play more what order you should go for in which situation. So it's a matter of experience, but rule of thumb, this order. I kind of went over this already, but I want to reiterate this just to make it very clear that personally, I never mulligan Field Contact. Just always keep the card. That it might seem weird in situations, but I can assure you that I have not been disappointed in keeping Field Contact almost ever, and I can't really think of situations where I wouldn't keep the card. Do you play Octobot on 2 versus Quest Shaman? As a rule of thumb, I'd say no. The odds of them killing your Octobot with, say, spell damage plus Perpetual or Bolt, or say Wandmaker into Revolve, the Evolving Missiles, you name it. While I don't think it's as much about the risk of it dying, because I think that one is rather low, it's more of that your main goal against Shaman is to amass a big hand, and they have trouble coming back from a huge Field Contact turn. So it's not about it being good on tempo, but more as like you want to hit more cards with Octobot. And if you play it on 2, then generally you don't hit more than 4 cards, I think. It's something like that. So rule of thumb, no. If they have like an insane Lightning Bloom tempo start, there's for sure a reason to do it. There's always exceptions, but I'd say generally not. Next question. how liberal are you with spell damage augmentation in certain matchups? Are they just removal versus aggro, or do you still hesitate to play them? I am very liberal, is what I say, if I play them a lot. I use my first ethereal augment pretty much whenever it fits, if it's to kill a minion or if it's to activate Octobot. I think it's important to mainly focus on being able to go off quickly in most matchups, and by using at least one augment, you can very much salvage it by, as I mentioned earlier, by saving one Shadow Step or something like that. In matchups like Priest, Hunter, Aggro Druid, Elemental Shaman, in those matchups, I've even been, I think I played a Feral Augmerchant, coin a Feral Augmerchant in those matchups, if it's good for tempo. So in tempo matchups, you can be super liberal with them. The first one, you can be very liberal about, but after you used your first one, then you really gotta stop and think for the second one. But generally, I just spend the first one with ease, or if I'm against aggro, I can find myself using both. Next question is about more of a deck building thing than how to play the deck, which I think is valid and a very good question. What do you think are the flexible slots? As you can see in the list I recommend here on the side, I'm playing SI7 Skulker instead of Kazakus and Fraud, which is more of the standard list. You also see a lot of notable players play Tenflinger or similar. The slots that I think are somewhat flexible in the deck would be the two slots where I have SI7 Skulker. I think that preparation is core, and that's never something I would cut. And I would not tinker on the card draw or removal. For example, I think I see some people cut Brain Freeze, but I always think two of those are core. Kazakus, Flinger, and similar, SI7 Skulker, these are slots that I think can be replaced, and the final 30 of this deck is gonna come down to some combination of those. One tech that has even started to float around lately, I think thanks to Sirius, is Talented Arcanist, as since it works with bleeds in a favorable way. That could also find its way into the final build. But I think that the first 28 cards are core, and then the SI7 Skulkers or whatever is in place of those slots I think can be tinkered around with. Shout out to everyone that left questions on my Twitter. It was super helpful for me to be able to get this guide together. Really appreciate that. As for the guide, I've been talking long enough, and it's been fun, and I hope that I covered most things, and that if you watch through it all, that I mentioned a thing or two that will make you a better Garrote Rogue player. Once again, don't forget to drop a subscribe if you like the content. Follow me on Twitter, Twitch, etc. I hope you enjoy, and let me know if you appreciated the guide and if you would like to see more gameplay sort of content. I'll try to see if I can upload some cool games that I played with the deck, because I've certainly got a lot stocked up from my stream. Either way, thanks for watching. Super appreciate it. Hope you have a good one. Bye. Fast response. I look at my chat a lot. Floki, Floki, Floki. Dreadeye, who made a joke, this deck beats itself more than the opponents do. If you look at the stats, it's true. It's true. I think the thing is that I don't think that such a thing as perfect play will be achieved with this deck. Because I don't think that, like, even if you are the best player in the world, I don't think you could play this deck enough to be able to, like, play it perfectly. Especially not if you're named Requiem. Then it's just a lost case before we even started. But so it's hard to say like how many. I wish there were like this like chess things that. Of course, I'm kidding. But I wish we had these like chess things or like these bots that could just calculate the perfect place, but that can't really happen in Hearthstone, can it? Pretty bad, Neo. There's a good field contact. Oh my goodness. Oh, I could step the Neo now. There's someone like cutting grass outside my freaking window, and I have a headset on, and I can still hear it. This turn was not great for me. Oh. I don't think I played a Skulker even. I might be supposed to step the I'm definitely stepping Octo here. That's the play. 30 games ago, I would not have spotted this play. I would have not stepped Octobot, but now I have a slightly deeper understanding of this matchup, and I get that you want to do this very often. And I think it might be like a big deal in this game. Oh, was on 80 damage for Warlock, but under the effect of little 4 neophytes. Yeah. I feel like you like start to get the deck, you're like, oh sweet, okay, I can play it rather well now. And then then you're like, oh shit, now I have to learn how to play around neophytes. Actual nightmare. But yeah, when you actually nail it with this deck, things feel so good. Okay, I need the help of the prize plunderers. When coil or second neophyte. Oh, second neophyte. Oh, I hadn't played neophyte this turn, maybe. I mean, I can step the field contact. Oh, that's so good. Oh, that was the nut series of draws. What the fuck? That was insane. String of draws. Because now I have they're under neophyte and I have the protected contact. He can remove it, but point is that it takes their entire turn. And also, like, you can't soul rend this. There's no combination with soul rend that does it, right? So if this gets removed, then I have the tempo from the rest of my board. Then I can just go for the aggro plan. Oof. Vacation. contact. Nice. How many cards do I have in hand? 6. You can snap freeze actually over Ruined Orb. Then how do I trade? Probably use the Neophyte, or do I use the Brain Freeze? Oh, boomer, boomer, boomer. Oh, wait, got there. No, didn't get there. Wait. Solar Enemy. I want the board space. Loki. That ain't me though. Feels clean, man. Hello, Blip Blip. How's it going? That just sounds like a game that felt